Monique was no stranger to hard work. From the moment she started her first job as a teenager, she had promised herself that one day she would enjoy the life she had dreamed of. Growing up in a modest home, she often imagined what it would feel like to experience the luxuries she saw in magazines and movies. It wasn't just about wealth or status, it was about proving to herself that she was capable of achieving something extraordinary. Now, years later, she had done just that. Through determination, late nights, and sacrifices, Monique had built a thriving business from scratch. She was proud of the life she had created, but she was even prouder of the person she had become. She had weathered storms, faced countless setbacks, and emerged stronger each time. So, when Monique finally booked herself a first-class ticket for a much-needed vacation, it was more than just a flight. It was a celebration of her hard work, a reminder of how far she had come. As she walked through the airport that morning, pulling her sleek carry-on bag and wearing a simple yet elegant outfit, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. This trip was about her, about finally giving herself the break she deserved. Boarding the plane, she felt a ripple of excitement. The plush first-class cabin was everything she had imagined. Soft leather seats, spacious legroom, and a calm, exclusive atmosphere. It was a stark contrast to the cramped economy seats she had flown in during her earlier years. The flight attendant greeted her with a polite but distant smile, directing her to her seat. As Monique settled in, she couldn't help but notice a few subtle things. The crew's smile seemed warmer toward other passengers. Conversations with her fellow travelers were effortless and jovial, but when it came to her, there was an air of detachment. She brushed it off at first. Perhaps she was imagining it. After all, she was here to relax, not to overthink. She adjusted her seat and took a deep breath. The soft hum of the engines was calming, and the promise of a peaceful flight made her smile. She looked forward to the champagne she'd heard so much about, one of the perks of flying first class. It wasn't just the drink itself, it was the symbolism. Champagne was a toast to success, to moments worth celebrating. When the flight attendant passed by her row, Monique caught their attention with a polite request. "Could I have a glass of champagne, please?" she asked, her tone light and cheerful. The attendant gave a quick nod but didn't return. Monique assumed they were busy and decided to wait patiently. She watched as other passengers received their glasses, each one sparkling in the warm cabin light. The golden liquid looked inviting, and she imagined the taste a perfect balance of sweetness and fizz. Minutes passed, and still, no champagne. Monique glanced down the aisle, spotting the same attendant laughing softly as they served another passenger. She frowned slightly but told herself not to make a big deal out of it. When the attendant walked by again, she tried once more. "Excuse me, I believe I requested champagne earlier," she said, her voice calm but firm. The attendant barely glanced at her. "I'll get to it," they replied curtly before walking away. Monique felt a twinge of irritation. It wasn't just about the drink anymore. It was the way she had been dismissed, like her request didn't matter, like she didn't belong. She watched as the other passengers were treated with attentive care, their needs met almost before they voiced them. By the third time she asked, her patience was wearing thin. "Could I please have a glass of champagne?" she repeated, her tone clipped but still polite. The attendant's response was a dismissive shrug. "We're running low, and it's reserved for priority passengers." Monique stared at them, stunned. Priority passengers? She was seated in first class, wasn't she? She had paid the same premium price as everyone else here, yet she was being treated like an afterthought. Her mind raced as she processed the moment. It wasn't just about the champagne anymore, it was about respect. About the principle of being treated with the same dignity as everyone else. As she sat back in her seat, trying to remain calm, her thoughts turned inward. She had encountered subtle biases before, in boardrooms, meetings, and even casual social settings. It wasn't always overt, but it was there, a lingering doubt in others' eyes, an assumption that she didn't belong. But Monique wasn't the type to let these moments define her. She had worked too hard, overcome too much, to let a dismissive flight attendant ruin her day. Still, the sting of the incident lingered, a reminder that even in moments of success, she was sometimes seen through a different lens. Looking around the cabin, she noticed the ease with which other passengers enjoyed their experience. Their laughter, the clinking of glasses, the seamless service, it all underscored the contrast in her own treatment. And yet, instead of feeling defeated, Monique felt something else stirring within her. A quiet resolve. She wasn't sure how or when, but she knew one thing for certain: this moment, this seemingly small act of disrespect, would not be forgotten. Monique had learned long ago that every challenge held an opportunity, and she was determined to turn this one into something meaningful. As the plane soared into the clouds, Monique's mind was already at work. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about setting a standard, about ensuring that no one else would feel the way she did in this moment. She had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was clear: this flight would mark the beginning of something much bigger than she ever imagined. And as the flight attendant continued to overlook her, Monique made a quiet vow to herself: this isn't over. Monique shifted slightly in her seat, her eyes drifting to the other passengers in the first-class cabin. The man a few rows ahead was deep in conversation with a flight attendant who seemed completely at ease, smiling warmly as she refilled his champagne glass without being asked. Across the aisle, a couple laughed softly, their glasses sparkling under the cabin's dim light. She glanced down at her empty tray table. It wasn't just the absence of the drink that bothered her anymore, it was the message it sent. The subtle but clear divide between how she was treated versus everyone else in the cabin was impossible to ignore. She wasn't the type to seek validation from others, but being openly dismissed was something no one should have to tolerate. This flight, which had started as a symbol of how far she'd come, was quickly turning into a lesson in how far things still had to go. Monique couldn't shake the irony. Here she was, a self-made woman who had clawed her way to success in an industry that wasn't always welcoming, only to find herself dismissed in a setting where respect should have been a given. But Monique wasn't the kind of person to cause a scene. She had always believed in choosing her battles carefully. She knew that real power didn't come from raising her voice in frustration, it came from leveraging moments like these to create change. She leaned back in her seat, trying to distract herself by flipping through the in-flight magazine. Pictures of exotic destinations and high-end products filled the glossy pages, but they couldn't hold her attention. Her mind kept drifting back to the flight attendant's dismissive tone and the smug way they had said, "reserved for priority passengers." The words lingered in her mind like an uninvited guest. What exactly made someone a priority passenger? Was it wealth? Influence? The assumption that someone like her, someone who didn't fit their narrow expectations, couldn't possibly belong here? Her thoughts were interrupted when another flight attendant passed by, this one carrying a tray of refreshments. Monique sat up slightly, hoping this might be her chance to finally be acknowledged. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Could I get some champagne, please?" The attendant paused, looking at her as if considering whether to comply. After a moment, they nodded and said, "I'll check for you." But Monique wasn't naive. She could see it in their eyes, the same indifference, the same subtle doubt. And just like before, they didn't return. Monique's patience was wearing thin, but she maintained her composure. She had spent years perfecting the art of staying calm under pressure. In business, emotional outbursts rarely led to successful outcomes. Instead, she focused on observing, strategizing, and waiting for the right moment to act. Still, a part of her couldn't help but feel the sting of the moment. She wasn't just any passenger. She was a woman who had fought against every odd to sit in this seat, to afford this experience, to claim her place in spaces where she had been told she didn't belong. And yet, here she was, being reminded in the subtlest of ways that some people would never see her as equal. Her mind flashed back to the countless times she had faced similar moments of quiet prejudice. The boardroom meetings where her ideas were dismissed until a male colleague repeated them. The networking events where people assumed she was someone's assistant rather than the CEO of her own company. Each time, she had risen above it, using those moments as fuel to push herself further. But this moment felt different. Maybe it was the setting, a luxurious cabin where everyone was supposed to be treated like royalty. Or maybe it was the blatant nature of the dismissal, happening in plain view of other passengers who either didn't notice or chose to look the other way. Whatever the reason, Monique felt a fire building within her, a quiet determination that this would not be the end of the story. She glanced out the window, watching the clouds drift by like slow-moving waves. The vastness of the sky was calming, a reminder of how small this moment was in the grand scheme of things. And yet, she couldn't ignore the importance of standing up for herself, not just for her own dignity, but for the countless others who had been made to feel invisible in similar situations. As the flight continued, Monique decided to shift her focus. Instead of dwelling on the treatment she had received, she began to think about solutions. What could she do to ensure that no one else experienced what she was going through right now? How could she turn this moment of disrespect into a catalyst for change? Her mind raced with possibilities. She thought about her business, her network, her resources. She wasn't just a passenger, she was a problem solver, a leader, someone who knew how to turn setbacks into opportunities. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, Monique began to draft a plan in her mind. It was still rough, just a series of ideas floating in her thoughts, but it was enough to give her a sense of purpose. She knew one thing for certain: this flight might have started as a simple journey, but it would end as the beginning of something much bigger. She glanced around the cabin once more, her gaze steady and unyielding. The flight attendants who had dismissed her, the passengers who hadn't noticed, none of them knew who they were dealing with. They didn't know her story, her resilience, her ability to turn challenges into triumphs. But they would. By the time this flight landed, Monique vowed to herself, the seeds of change would already be planted. And as she sat back, her expression calm but resolute, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Expanding further, Monique's thoughts drifted to her upbringing, to the lessons her grandmother had taught her about dignity and perseverance. Never let anyone make you feel small, her grandmother had said, her voice steady and wise. You hold your head high, no matter what. Those words had carried Monique through some of her toughest moments, through rejection letters, failed deals, and moments of doubt. They were the reason she had kept pushing forward, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And now, sitting in this first-class seat, she felt those words echoing in her mind. This wasn't just about a glass of champagne. It was about everything she had worked for, everything she represented. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had ever been made to feel less than, for every person who had ever been denied the respect they deserved. The flight continued, the hum of the engines a constant background noise. Monique closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself a moment of calm. She knew that the real battle wouldn't be fought here, on this plane. It would happen later, when she had the chance to use her voice, her influence, and her resources to make a difference. She opened her eyes, feeling a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The flight attendant's words hung in the air, sharp and cold. I'm sorry, ma'am, champagne is reserved for priority passengers, they repeated, their tone laced with an edge that made it impossible to mistake for politeness. Monique's mind raced, disbelief washing over her. Priority passengers. She thought, her grip tightening on the armrest. She glanced down at her boarding pass as if to double-check what she already knew. She was seated in first class, the same as everyone else here. She looked around the cabin, her eyes landing on the other passengers. A man 2 rows ahead was chatting casually with a flight attendant who had just poured him a fresh glass of champagne. A woman across the aisle raised her glass to toast her companion, both of them laughing softly as they sipped the golden liquid. Monique felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Why was she being treated differently? At first, she tried to give the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the attendant was overwhelmed, distracted, or simply having a bad day. But as the minutes passed, the reality became clear: Monique wasn't being treated the same as the other first-class passengers. It wasn't just the champagne. It was the small but undeniable differences in how she was acknowledged or ignored. When the attendants walked by, their smiles were warm and genuine for others, but curt and distant for her. The casual banter they shared with other passengers, non-existent when it came to Monique. She had felt this kind of subtle exclusion before, but here, in a space meant for comfort and equality, it stung in a way she hadn't anticipated. Monique took a deep breath, trying to calm the frustration bubbling inside her. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. It wasn't about the drink anymore. It was about the principle, about being treated with the same respect as everyone else. She pressed the call button, determined to address the issue calmly. When the same attendant approached, Monique met their gaze, her voice steady but firm. "Excuse me, I believe I asked for champagne earlier." The attendant's expression didn't shift. "Yes, ma'am. As I mentioned, it's reserved for priority passengers." Monique's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm in first class, just like everyone else. Can you clarify what you mean by priority passengers?" The attendant hesitated, their composure faltering for a moment. It's a policy for frequent flyers and premium members," they said quickly before stepping back, as if eager to end the conversation. Monique's jaw tightened. She had flown with this airline before enough times to know their policies. This explanation didn't add up. She watched as the attendant moved on, her frustration mounting. Was this really happening? She wondered. In a space where every passenger had paid a premium for equal treatment, why was she being made to feel like an outsider? The rest of the flight continued much the same. The attendant's polite indifference toward her became more glaring with each passing moment. They avoided eye contact when they walked by, their interactions with her minimal and perfunctory. Monique felt the weight of their dismissive behavior like a heavy cloak. She wasn't the type to let things get to her easily, but this experience was different. It wasn't just about her, it was about the message their actions were sending. Her mind flashed back to past experiences where she had been overlooked, underestimated, or outright dismissed. The boardroom meetings where her ideas were ignored until someone else repeated them. The networking events where people assumed she was someone's assistant rather than the founder and CEO of her own company. Each of those moments had left a mark, but they had also fueled her determination to succeed. She had vowed long ago never to let anyone's bias define her. But this time, the insult felt personal. She wasn't just another face in the crowd, she was a paying passenger who deserved the same level of respect as anyone else in that cabin. As Monique sat in her seat, trying to keep her emotions in check, she noticed something that solidified her resolve. Across the aisle, another passenger waved down an attendant and casually requested a second glass of champagne. The request was met with a smile and an immediate response. Within moments, their glass was refilled, the bubbles rising to the surface as if mocking Monique's own empty tray table. Her stomach churned with a mix of disbelief and anger. She wasn't imagining this. The difference in treatment was as clear as day. For a moment, she considered letting it go. After all, it was just a drink, wasn't it? But then she stopped herself. This wasn't about the champagne anymore. It was about respect, about dignity, about standing up for herself in the face of unfair treatment. Monique leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. She could feel the eyes of a few nearby passengers on her, their expressions unreadable. Were they noticing the difference in how she was being treated? Did they care? She clenched her fists, a familiar fire igniting within her. This wasn't the first time she had faced adversity, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But one thing was certain, she wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. As the flight continued, Monique began to observe more closely. She watched the way the crew interacted with each passenger, noting the subtle but undeniable differences in tone, body language, and attentiveness. It wasn't just her imagination. The favoritism was real, and she was being deliberately excluded. Her thoughts turned inward, reflecting on what this moment represented. She had spent her life working twice as hard to earn her place in spaces where she was often unwelcome. This flight, this first-class seat, was supposed to be a symbol of how far she had come. Instead, it had become a painful reminder of the biases that still lingered, even in spaces designed for comfort and equality. But Monique wasn't the type to dwell on negativity. She had learned long ago that every challenge was an opportunity in disguise. As she sat in silence, her mind began to work, piecing together a plan. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel invisible, every person who had been told through actions or words that they didn't belong. By the time the plane touched down, Monique had made a decision. She wasn't going to let this experience end here. She was going to turn this moment of disrespect into something meaningful, something that would leave a lasting impact. Because if there was one thing Monique knew for sure, it was this: she had the power to create change. And she wasn't afraid to use it. Monique folded her hands on her lap, her fingers lightly drumming against her thigh as she looked out the window. The airplane soared through the clouds, but her mind was far from the serene view outside. Each interaction or lack thereof played back in her head, fueling her frustration. Her decision was made: this wasn't going to slide. But where to begin? Monique wasn't someone who jumped into action without a plan. She prided herself on being methodical and strategic. Years of navigating corporate spaces where she often felt underestimated had taught her the power of composure. The flight attendant passed by again, their demeanor a stark contrast to the friendly smiles they offered to the other passengers. Monique raised her hands slightly to catch their attention. This time, she would make herself impossible to ignore. "Excuse me," she began, her tone calm but assertive. "I noticed other passengers being served champagne. I'd like to know why my request hasn't been fulfilled." The attendant stopped, their face a mixture of irritation and unease. "As I mentioned earlier, ma'am, champagne is reserved for priority passengers." "And what exactly qualifies someone as a priority passenger?" Monique asked, her voice unwavering. The attendant hesitated, clearly unprepared for the question. "It's company policy," they said vaguely before quickly walking away. Monique let out a slow breath, her patience wearing thin. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, a familiar sensation she had encountered in countless other settings where her presence had been questioned or minimized. But she wasn't going to back down. Underscore 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 on. As the flight continued, Monique's observations sharpened. The way the attendants moved through the cabin with practiced ease, their smiles for some passengers genuine and warm while for others they were fleeting and perfunctory. It was all so deliberate, so subtle, but to someone like Monique, someone who had spent a lifetime reading between the lines, it was glaringly obvious. Her thoughts drifted back to her first experiences in spaces like this. As a young woman climbing the corporate ladder, she had often felt like an outsider, constantly having to prove that she belonged. The microaggressions, the dismissive comments, the unspoken rules of who deserved respect and who didn't, it was all so familiar. She had worked tirelessly to overcome those barriers, building her own business from the ground up and earning her seat at the table. This first-class ticket was more than just a luxury, it was a testament to her hard work and determination. And yet, here she was, being reminded in no uncertain terms that for some people, her achievements didn't matter. Underscore 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 on. Monique's thoughts were interrupted by the clinking of glasses. Another passenger, seated just a few rows ahead, raised their hand and was immediately attended to. Within moments, they were handed a fresh glass of champagne with a smile and a nod. She clenched her jaw. It wasn't about the drink anymore, it was about the principle. Monique leaned forward, her determination solidifying. She pressed the call button again, her resolve unshaken. This time, a different flight attendant approached, their expression neutral. "How can I help you, ma'am?" they asked. Monique met their gaze, her voice steady. "I'd like to speak with the purser, please." The attendant blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Is there a problem?" "Yes," Monique replied simply. "And I'd prefer to address it with the person in charge." Underscore 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 on. The purser arrived a few minutes later, their demeanor professional but guarded. "Good evening, ma'am. I understand you requested to speak with me. How can I assist you?" Monique took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I've noticed a significant difference in how passengers in this cabin are being treated, and I'd like to understand why." The purser frowned slightly, their posture shifting as if bracing for an uncomfortable conversation. "I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am. Can you elaborate?" Monique nodded. "I've observed that other passengers' requests are being fulfilled promptly and without hesitation. Meanwhile, my request for champagne has been dismissed multiple times, with the explanation that it's reserved for priority passengers. Can you clarify what that means?" The purser hesitated, their professional facade faltering for a moment. "I apologize if there's been any misunderstanding. Our staff is trained to provide equal service to all first-class passengers." "That hasn't been my experience," Monique said, her voice firm but composed. "And I'd like to know why." Underscore 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 on. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Nearby passengers, who had previously been immersed in their own worlds, now glanced in Monique's direction. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable, as if unsure how to react to the confrontation unfolding before them. The purser offered a strained smile. "I'll look into this matter personally, ma'am. Please accept our apologies for any inconvenience." Monique didn't respond immediately. She studied the purser's expression, searching for sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you. I'll hold you to that." As the purser walked away, Monique leaned back in her seat, her mind still racing. She had made her point, but the larger issue remained. This wasn't just about her treatment on this flight, it was about the systemic biases that allowed such behavior to persist. Underscore 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 on. The remainder of the flight passed in relative silence. Monique received her champagne eventually, but the gesture felt hollow, a mere formality rather than a genuine attempt to make amends. As the plane began its descent, Monique's resolve only grew stronger. This experience wasn't going to be just another moment of quiet indignation. She was going to do something about it. Monique sat quietly in her seat, her expression calm but her mind anything but. She didn't react to the slight, not outwardly, at least. Instead, she chose to observe, her sharp eyes catching every detail, every nuance of how the crew interacted with the other passengers. She noticed the easy laughter shared between the attendants and a gentleman seated a few rows ahead. How they leaned in slightly when he spoke, nodding attentively, their smiles genuine and wide. Then there was the woman across the aisle who requested a blanket. Her request was met with immediate action and a cheerful, "Of course, right away." But when it came to Monique, the difference was unmistakable. The same warmth and attentiveness disappeared as if on cue. The smiles faded into curt nods, and any interaction with her was strictly transactional, devoid of the friendliness extended to others. It wasn't the first time Monique had experienced